I'm Garrick Francis. This is the Inheritance to Income podcast, a space where we help families, founders, and leaders move from legacy by default to legacy by design. If you're building something for the next generation and you're not quite sure what comes next, you're in the right place. I'm your legacy advocate. Let's talk about it. Across the United States, millions of business owners are approaching retirement. Many built their companies over 30 or 40 years. Some started in garages, some built regional brands, some created businesses that quietly employ dozens and sometimes hundreds of people. These companies are not venture backed startups, they're not Silicon Valley unicorns. They were built on sweat equity and family investment. They're the economic backbone of communities across the country. But a massive transition is coming. Researchers estimate that roughly 10 million small businesses in the United States are owned by baby boomers, people 55 and over, like me. Many of those founders will step away over the next decade, and trillions of dollars in business value will change hands during this period. This is what economists and journalists call the Silver Tsunami. When journalists talk about it, their focus is usually economic. Who will buy the businesses? Will they close? Will jobs disappear? Those are very important questions. But there's another dimension that receives far less attention. Family alignment. Because behind many of these businesses is a family system that was never designed for transition. It wasn't designed for the next generation to take over. And you see, family businesses operate inside two systems at the same time. There's the family system and the business system. The family system runs on relationships, shared history, emotion. The business system requires structure, authority, accountability. When those two systems overlap without intentional design, boundaries begin to blur and problems begin to happen. Feedback begins to feel personal instead of professional. Performance conversations often get delayed. Leadership discussions get avoided altogether. Over time, that hesitation creates friction. Founders begin asking questions like, why are decisions slowing down? Why does leadership feel hesitant? Why does everything feel harder than it used to? Often the answer is not strategy. Often the answer is structure. And there are four fracture points that appear again and again in family enterprises. First, there's unnamed authority. Titles may exist, people may have been given a title and an office, but behavior tells the real story. Who actually makes the final decision? Who do employees go to or defer to when things start to get a little chaotic? Who resolves disagreements between different parts of the organization? If those answers change depending upon the situation, authority is not structured, and uncertainty slows execution. Second, assumed alignment. Many families believe they're aligned because conflict hasn't surfaced, but the lack of conflict is not proof of alignment. Alignment shows itself and becomes visible when priorities are tested. What happens when growth requires investment instead of distribution? What happens when risk tolerance differs among so called leaders in the organization or company? If those conversations never happen openly, alignment is just theoretical and a bit hopeful. And hopeful and theoretical alignment eventually collapses under pressure. Third, there's role imbalance. When one sibling carries operational responsibility and a cousin has logistics, and another remains less involved but expects equal influence, over time, a certain amount of resentment builds quietly. And so, balanced responsibilities does not require identical roles or identical titles, but it does require identical clarity and agreement on what those roles are. Fourth, silence. Silence about the future. Founders hesitate to name transition timelines because they hold on to what they've built. Successors tend to hesitate to ask about what comes next. They don't want to seem like they're trying to push out those who have built. And that silence creates anxiety. And clarity does not require a fixed date, but it does require visible intention and regular activity. And so many transitions struggle, not because of money, but because alignment inside the family was never clarified. Imagine this: a founder who spent 30 years building a successful company, loyal employees, trusting customers, it's financially healthy, has a great relationship with the local banks. From outside, everything looks stable. But inside the family, something has never been clarified. Two siblings both work in the company. One runs the sales department and one runs strategy. Both care deeply about the future. Both are looking towards what their future means. But no one took time to define authority and roles in transition. So every major decision becomes a negotiation and sometimes a competition. Employees watch the room to see whose opinion carries more weight with the founder. Momentum tends to fade, not because the business is weak, but because the leadership structure was never intentionally designed to evolve. The business is not failing, it's the alignment underneath that was never clarified. And there's another layer to this people rarely talk about. When alignment problems exist inside a family business, they usually don't stay inside the office. They show up at the family dinner table. They show up at holidays. They show up in conversations that suddenly feel tense, even when the topic has nothing to do with the company. Because business disagreements become family disagreements. And once that line blurs, it becomes very difficult to separate those roles. But it can separate a family. A business can recover from a difficult quarter, but families sometimes spend decades recovering from a poorly handled transition. And now the silver tsunami also creates a certain amount of opportunity. Across the country, thousands of businesses with strong fundamentals will soon need new leadership. A new generation of operators is stepping into that space because families don't always have an immediate successor. And sometimes the younger generations of those families have moved on into other careers, other opportunities. And so they're not in a position to take over that family business. And so this makes space for what is sometimes called aquapreneurs and investorpreneurs. Aquapreneurs acquire existing businesses and operate them, leaving the corporate world, coming from a different location or a smaller business. They acquire an established business with good fundamentals and good relationships, and that becomes their life's work. A legacy that's passed on not by DNA, but by vision. Investorpreneurs invest capital and leadership to grow businesses. Instead of starting something from scratch or taking over operational control, they step into organizations with history, with employees, with customers, and they provide the financial backing to help that business move forward, and they are rewarded for their investment. But here's the distinction: buying a business is a transaction, stewarding a business is a responsibility that builds legacy. And so successful transitions usually rest on four elements: vision, authority, stewardship, and alignment. The vision clarifies where the enterprise is going. The authority clarifies who decides. Stewardship focuses leaders on protecting what was built for the next generation and generations after. And alignment ensures everyone understands how those decisions are made. When those four elements are present, legacy becomes sustainable. Without them, transitions drift. Legacy rarely sorts itself out naturally. Left alone, most transitions move forward by default. When leaders ask early enough, what does the next chapter look like? Legacy begins to move by design. So here's the exercise. Within the next 30 days, define one authority domain clearly, one decision path. Schedule one conversation that has been postponed. Outline one transition intention and practice it. Give the authority. Set the established rules. Let people know what's going on. Progress doesn't require perfection, but it requires movement towards clarity. It requires some testing to allow people to understand that a transition is going to take place, that a future is at hand, that growth is on the horizon, and that once the organization or the business escapes the gravity of the founder, that it has infinite possibilities. Your business may not be failing, but if the family system beneath it lacks alignment, strain will eventually surface. Authority clarified reduces tension. Alignment strengthens trust. Unaccustomed conversations held early prevent conflict later. Inheritance may begin by default, but legacy requires design. So if you're intentional about building something for the next generation, if your desire is to provide for your children's children a pathway to impact your community, your business, and the greater world, take time to focus on aligning the family system and the business system. When those two things are aligned, generational impact, global impact is not just possible, it's probable. I'm Garrick Francis. I thank you for the time you've granted me. God bless.